So today we are nearing the end of our first unit, Metaphysics and Epistemology. We began by looking at various theories of knowledge, how we obtain knowledge of the universe around us, like rationalism and empiricism. And then we also looked at some metaphysical views that can explain what all this is made of, and how it works. We looked at least three views. Dualism, which argued that two fundamental substances make up everything, right? Matter, or physical stuff, and mind, or mental stuff. This was the view of Descartes. He thought that consciousness and the stuff that makes up a table are two different things. They're not reducible to one another, they're different in kind. But we can contrast this view with monism. We looked at two monistic views so far. The contemporary scientific view, which says basically everything is just made of matter, including the human brain, including the human mind. So your thoughts, ideas, hopes, dreams, and feelings are just certain arrangements of matter, or certain wave functions, if you want to talk a little bit more physically about it. And that we can explain that stuff through physical explanation about neurons firing, electrical impulses, chemical reactions in the brain, etc. But then we contrasted that view with Berkeley's view, who thinks that it's more parsimonious, it actually makes more sense of the world, that matter doesn't actually exist. We don't need to invoke this mental abstraction of this thing that we never tasted or really touched. And we can explain the existence of everything by appealing to this idea that really it's all mental stuff. That's what makes up everything. And as you know from our lecture and our discussions, Berkeley thinks that the reason why we have similar perceptions, the reason why it seems like there's regularity in our understanding of the world and we can communicate about that, is because God is responsible for creating all this stuff. And God didn't just make this stuff randomly, but it operates according to certain rules and laws, what we might call the laws of nature in the natural sciences. Today we're talking about an issue that relates directly to some of these metaphysical views that we've been looking at. And that is the debate over free will. Whether or not humans have free will, whether or not free will is a possibility, and what that might imply about ethics, morality, and therefore, well, how we should organize ourselves politically, socially, and all of that. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And the reason why it's important is because, well, as I tried to explain to you in one of our previous lectures, what you think makes up the world is going to influence the rest of your beliefs. Whether you think the human mind is a different thing than the body and the brain is going to influence what you think on this issue specifically. In this issue, whether or not you think humans have free will, whether or not that's a possibility, is going to influence the rest of your beliefs too, such as whether or not we can and should blame or praise people for things, whether or not punishment is justified, what you think about the criminal justice system, all of that. So that's why we're looking at this view. It is one that is going to necessarily inform and guide your other beliefs. So if we're going to talk about that stuff, well, we need to talk about the fundamental things first. So I'm going to start out today by giving you some helpful definitions and terms that Strawson uses a lot in this piece that will allow us to help frame this debate over the existence and possibility of free will that has been going on for centuries, if not thousands of years. So this is not a new topic. This is not a new debate. It's one that philosophers are still arguing about to this day. So, let's begin. The first definition I'd like to get on the board is going to be central to our discussion of whether or not free will exists today. And that is determinism. Determinism is a particular view or theory about how the world works. I believe Strawson defines it as follows. It's the view that everything that happens in the universe is necessitated by what has already gone before, in such a way that nothing can happen otherwise than it does. So let me write that down, and then I will kind of explain that in more accessible terms here. This word necessitated is important. So the basic view is this. The reason why everything is the way that it is right now is because of what stuff was like in the past, how that was going, what mental reactions and physical processes were occurring. The reason that stuff happened is because what previous states and conditions were like. So, in some sense, there is a path that the universe is going down, that there are reasons that things are happening. It's not just random. There's a certain law, an order, a fixedness to what happens. And basically, there's just going to be one way things go. Okay? So, another way of explaining this, as I just kind of invoked, is the reason why things are happening right now the way that they are is because what has gone before has caused them to be that way. You can explain this or use an example in terms of physical processes and chemical reactions. Why do certain neurotransmitters, why are they being released in your brain right now? Well, a particular biochemical reaction produced that. How much of the neurotransmitter got produced? Well, that was determined by that precise reaction, how much of the different molecules you had, what their precise configurations were, all of that. So, in actuality, what this implies is the way that things are right now are going to necessarily determine what the future is like. Does that make sense? Basically, what this idea is trying to express is there is a certain order, there's a certain law as to why things are happening the way that they are. And we can just invoke previous states and configurations of matter and all of that to explain what's happening right now. Why was that stuff the way that it was? Well, it was because of what came before, how all that was. Why was that the way it was? Well, it was because of what came before and how all that was. And we could trace out this story back to the origins of the universe if we wanted, to the Big Bang. In essence, why are things the way they are right now? Because of the initial conditions that our universe was in at its inception. This is determinism. And it's one that has received a lot of evidence and support from the natural sciences over the last few centuries. So, we have that. Determinism is the view that everything that happens in the universe is necessitated by what has already gone before, in such a way that nothing can happen otherwise than it does. if we knew everything about the universe right now, all the different states of matter, what everything was in, all of that, we could predict what the future was going to be like. Because we know what the laws of nature are, how these things interact, all of that. Another thing that we have to try to define if we're going to talk about whether or not free will exists is, well, what exactly is free will? Now, there are a lot of different ideas and definitions of this term. Let me put it to you before I write down what I think is a fine definition. What do you think free will is? If somebody says you have free will, what do they mean? You can do whatever you want? Okay, yeah, not a bad first starting definition. But you can't fly, right? If you wanted to fly and you're not able to fly, would we say that you don't have free will? Maybe not. But yeah, that's kind of how people colloquially understand it, right? Is you have some sort of choice in what you do. Yeah? What do the rest of y'all think? What do you think free will means?
I was going to say that, but with limitations, because like you can't harm other people or yourself while you're, as laws.
Okay.
There's some sort of structure to it.
So there are constraints on what is possible for us, right? What we can do, what we should do. But presumably what you're invoking there is some sort of idea like, look, at any point in time, there are multiple paths before you, right? And you can choose which path to go down. Maybe you could have chosen to go to a different university. You could have chosen not to come to class today. You could have chosen to pack a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with barbecue chips instead of macaroni and cheese, right? Any other ideas, or do those seem to ring true for you? Is that kind of what you think free will means? Yeah.
I think like free will is like, to me it's like more of a mindset.
Okay.
Because like she was saying, like physically we're limited to those three choices. Like if we have those three choices, like I don't know if that's like truly free will because that is still like a limitation. But I feel like when it comes to like the mind, I mean, sure we could argue that there's limitations on like comprehension, but like
Sure.
There really isn't like limitations on what your mind can like think and believe and like.
Okay, so you have some sort of control over your thoughts, at least some of them.
Yeah.
And that has to do with free will. Yeah, my colloquial understanding is basically an amalgamation of what y'all just said. Philosophers define free will in a few different ways. I'm going to give you two definitions here. The first one is the colloquial understanding. Having the ability to choose what one thinks and does. Some sort of ability to choose what you're thinking about right now, what you're going to do in the future, what you're going to have for lunch, all that stuff. Now, obviously, there are limitations, right? We can't choose to do anything because our bodies work in a certain way, right? We can't choose to flap our wings really, really fast, or our arms really, really fast and fly, right? That's not something that we can do. But with the capacities that we have, I think what people seem to mean by free will is you can use those capacities how you want. You can direct them how you will. So that's one definition we could have. That gives us some sort of insight, perhaps, into what we think it means to have free will, what free will is. There's another definition. This one doesn't give us as much information, but what philosophers mean to do when they use this second definition is to describe the relationship between free will and moral responsibility. If I put you on the operating table and I slice your skull open and I put a bunch of little machines and sensors in there that allow me control of your brain, and then I throw you out into the world and I press a button and that causes you to whip your hand out and smack somebody, are you responsible for that? Are you morally responsible for hitting somebody in that instant? What do you think? No, why not? We want to say no, but why? What do you think? How would you? Because you didn't do it. What do you mean by that exactly?
Like you weren't in control.
Ah, there's the word, right? Control. It's associated with this idea of choice, right? We seem to think that to be morally responsible for something means you had to have control over what you were doing at that time, right? Yeah, that idea is associated with the second definition. Another way you could define free will is that which is required for moral responsibility, which is associated with this idea of control. I think these two definitions, do a good job of describing for us what we generally mean when we say free will, and then what philosophers and thinkers mean when they're talking about it in terms of ethics and moral responsibility. So it's good that we've gotten these two down because they're going to help frame our discussion today. Now, neither of these definitions tell us, right, whether we have free will, or perhaps whether or not our universe is such that free will is a possibility. Naturally, that's where thinkers and philosophers go next. There are a bunch of different positions you could have about free will, whether or not it's possible, whether or not it actually exists, whether or not it's compatible with this view of the universe, the deterministic view, which implies that there's one way things are going to go. The future is going to be a certain way because of the way things are right now. So, I would say there are basically four positions that you could have on free will. And Strawson talks about this in the article. First, you have what's called incompatibilism. Incompatibilism is a view about the relationship between free will and determinism. What do you think incompatibilism is going to say? What and what are incompatible? Throw out your best guess. Yeah.
Free will and determinism are incompatible.
Exactly. Right. Incompatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are incompatible. In other words, what it says is, if determinism is true, free will doesn't exist. But if free will exists, then determinism is not true. They can't both be true at the same time. Now, this view alone does not tell us whether or not free will does exist. It's just telling us what the relationship is between determinism and free will. The incompatibilists think if you have one, you can't have the other. Only one of these is true about the world. So, knowing that, there are two possible incompatibilist positions you could have. What are they? What do you think? If both of these can't be true, what are the two positions that people might take if they're an incompatibilist? Right, exactly. Yeah. One could be what's called a hard determinist. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is true, duh, so we don't have free will. Oftentimes, what the hard determinists are going to lean on to support this is they're going to say, look at the history of science. Okay? We know that the universe works according to these laws of nature. There are certain rules and principles that guide chemical reactions, biological processes, how physical things interact. Based on what we know of the universe, it seems as if what your brain is doing, for example, the emotions that you're having, are determined by the chemical reactions going on in your brain, the past, your genetics, all of that stuff. And that's making you have the feeling that you're having right now. So they're going to say, this determinism thing seems to be true, so nobody has free will. Okay, free will is an illusion, or it's a nice story that we like to tell ourselves. At bottom, there's only one way that things are going to go, and it's based on how things are. Generally, hard determinists are, well, they're very scientifically minded. A lot of them are materialists. They think of the human being, for example, as just a collection of atoms. You can't, in principle, have any control over what the atoms are doing in your body. They're just causing you to think and feel and do what you do, and to have the urges and desires that you have. Okay, so that's one view. What's the other view? It's not hard, right? What's the other view? Not that determinism is true, but exactly, yeah. It's the view that determinism is false. Free will does exist. We can call this libertarianism. Not the political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism. Okay? It's the view that determinism is false. Our universe is not deterministic. So, free will does exist. Is anybody here a libertarian? Do you think free will exists? Raise your hand if you think free will exists. Okay, what argument or evidence would you give in support of that? How would you convince me? Yeah.
I mean, everybody has their own way of doing things. If you didn't want to do something, you wouldn't do it. If you want to do it, you would do it.
Okay. So look, it seems like we have the ability to choose, right? Really choose, make choices. Are you determined to go eat at the cafeteria today? The libertarian is going to say, no, fuck that cafeteria. I hate its food. I'm not going to eat there. I choose not to eat there. It seems like we have free will. Did my brain make me do that? Or this? I can do what I want when I want. Look at that. Woo. Right? Doesn't it seem like you can just do things when you want? So it seems like we have free will, right? I can choose to listen to my intrusive thoughts, or I can choose to ignore them. I can choose to go to therapy or not. I can choose what I want for lunch. Nothing is forcing me or making me do the things that I do. Except maybe, like your heart beating or your breathing, right? That's like a process that you don't have complete control over. So they're going to say, yeah, free will exists. It's obvious, right? Seems like we have free will. People believe we have free will. Seems like we can basically do what we want when we want. So, the first camp is the camp of the incompatibilists. They think free will and determinism are incompatible. But you might not believe that. There are other views that you could have about this whole free will thing. What do you think compatibilism says? Shout it out. What does compatibilism say? Yeah. Right. The compatibilists are going to say, even if the universe is deterministic, there's one way things are going to go, that doesn't mean we don't have free will. They're going to say the incompatibilists have some strange definition of free will in which they think that the human person is somehow outside of the natural causal network of the universe, outside natural processes, that there's some sort of spirit or immaterial agent that is outside of the natural laws of the universe. They're like, no, you can accept that and still think free will exists. You can accept that there's one way things are going to go, and we still say you have free will. Right. Determinism does not disprove free will. Free will does not disprove determinism. They can go together. They're not mutually exclusive. We can still say you have free will, even if the universe is deterministic. Generally, what the compatibilists lean on in order to make this argument, support this position, is some sort of lesser conception of free will. They'd say free will isn't being able to do whatever the hell you want. That's not what we mean by free will. Free will is something like choosing to act on your desires or not. That's what we mean. Or they'll offer some other definitions of free will. So they think just because determinism is true, that doesn't show we don't have free will. I think they can both be true. Okay, so we have free will and determinism are incompatible. We have these two views which take different stances. We have compatibilism. What's another thing that you can say? What is the last position? I believe Strawson self-identifies with this last position. It starts with a P. Does anybody remember? If you're not optimistic, you're?
Pessimistic.
Right. Pessimism. Or what my undergraduate advisor used to call pessimism. No free will either wayism. If you're a pessimist about free will, you think that nobody has free will because it's impossible, regardless of whether determinism is true or not. This thing that we think we have, free will, is not something that we could have. It's not something we could have in principle, and it's not something that we do have. So, it doesn't matter if determinism is true. It's the view that free will is something we don't have either way. If we find out that the universe is deterministic, it doesn't matter. If we find out it's indeterministic and events are just random, that doesn't matter either. Why? Well, think about it this way. If your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions are just caused by what your brain is doing, and you don't have control over your brain, do you think you have free will? No, right? You're just like, my brain makes me do what I do. I don't have any real choice in the matter. So if you think the universe is deterministic, there's one way things are going to go, you don't think you have a choice. You don't think you really have free will. Okay, so no free will if the universe is deterministic. But let me ask you this. What if the universe is not deterministic? Some people think quantum mechanics shows that our universe is indeterministic. There doesn't seem to be an order at the bottom of how wave functions collapse and what these probability distributions turn into when perception looks at them. Events have occurred like randomly. But if what happens in the universe is just random, could you have free will? If how you think and feel right now is random, it's not following a deterministic process, how could you say you have free will? Right? So the pessimist is going to say, look, either the universe is deterministic or it's not. If it is deterministic, it doesn't seem like we have free will. If what happens is random, it's not subject to any natural laws or physical laws, then we couldn't have free will on that view either. So, we don't have free will. It's not something we can have, it's not something we do have. We could say pessimism or no free will either wayism is the view that free will is impossible regardless of whether determinism is true or not. It's not something we could have, consequently, it's not something we do have. So, these are some of the positions that you could have on this free will debate. You could be an incompatibilist. And if you're an incompatibilist, you're probably either going to be a hard determinist or a libertarian. Or you could be a compatibilist. Or you could say it doesn't matter whether the universe is deterministic or not. Free will is not something we could have in principle. It's impossible. Now, what does Strawson think? Well, at the beginning of this article, he lays this all out for us. He tries to describe for us the different positions or camps in this free will debate. He discusses their strengths and their weaknesses. But then what he does in kind of the middle of the paper is he provides an argument for the pessimistic view. An argument that he thinks is really good, that hopefully will convince us that free will cannot exist, and free will is not something that we do have. Basically, what he's doing in this article is he's providing an overview of the free will debate, and then he's weighing in on it. Here, I'll use a different marker here. This one's starting to go dry. Much better. And he connects his argument to moral responsibility. He's going to say, here's an argument that free will doesn't exist. What does this imply? Nobody's ultimately morally responsible for anything. So let's see if you agree with his argument. If you turn to page 4 of the article, he lays it out fairly clearly. Here's what he says in Luck Swallows Everything. One way of setting out the pessimist's argument is as follows. When you act, you do what you do in the situation in which you find yourself because of the way that you are. But then, to be truly or ultimately morally responsible for what you do, you must be truly or ultimately responsible for the way that you are, at least in certain crucial mental respects. But you can't be ultimately responsible for the way that you are in any respect at all. So, you can't be ultimately responsible for what you do. For to be ultimately responsible for the way that you are, you must have somehow intentionally brought it about that you are the way that you are. But the problem is this. Suppose you have somehow intentionally brought it about that the way you are now are in certain mental respects. That is, suppose you have brought it about that you have a certain mental nature, Z, in such a way that you can be said to be ultimately responsible for Z. For this to be true, you must already have had a certain mental nature Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have the mental nature Z. If you didn't have a mental nature, if you didn't already have a mental nature, then you didn't have any intentions or preferences and can't be responsible for the way that you now are. But then, for it to be true that you are ultimately responsible for how you now are, you must be ultimately responsible for having had that nature Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have Z. So you must have brought it about that you had Y. But then you must have existed already with a prior nature X, in the light of which you brought it about that you had Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have Z. And so on. Here one is setting off a potentially infinite regress. In order for one to be truly or ultimately responsible for how one is, in such a way that one can be truly responsible for what one does, something impossible has to be true. There has to be, and cannot be, a starting point in the series of acts bringing it about that one has a certain nature. A starting point that constitutes an act of ultimate self-origination. So, do you see what he's saying there? Basically, the argument is this. You do what you do because of the way that you are. We could say you do what you do because of the way that your mind is. Well, in order to be responsible for what you do, you had to have caused the way that your mind is. That led to the action. But in order to be responsible for the way that your mind is, you have to be responsible for the mental nature that made it so your mind is a certain way. Well, in order to be responsible for that, you have to have caused you having a certain psychology that produced that, which produced that. But you didn't choose to come into this world. You didn't choose what your genetics are. You didn't choose what your physical characteristics are. You didn't have any control over any of the stuff that caused the way that your mind is right now, ultimately. You're not God. You didn't create yourself. So, because you didn't create yourself and make yourself a certain way, you didn't have any control over that, you're not ultimately morally responsible for what you do, because you're not causally responsible for producing the kind of thing that you are that causes you to do what you do. Does that make sense? Here, I'll put it on the board in more accessible terms. Premise 1. In order to be morally responsible, an agent must be responsible for what they do. So far, so good. I think we would all agree with that. However, in order for an agent to be responsible for what they do, they must be the cause of their own mental states, which produce action. Because the reason that you do what you do is because of what your mind is like. Right? But nobody can be the ultimate cause of all of their mental states. That's the issue. We all came into this world through nothing that we did, right? You had no control over your genetics, your biology, your heritage, the time and place that you were born, how your brain would form. So you're not ultimately the cause of your own mental states. You can't be. What this implies is because you cannot be the cause of all your own mental states and all your own characteristics, you can't be the ultimate cause of what you are like, the kind of thing that you are. He calls this causa sui. Nothing can be the cause of itself. Causa sui. It's a Latin phrase. Thus, what's the conclusion? Because you were not the cause, you can't be, of the kind of thing that you are that makes you do what you do, you can't be ultimately morally responsible for anything. Therefore, No one is ultimately morally responsible for what they do. What do you think about this argument? Is this not a good argument? Because you could not determine the kind of thing that you are, which causes you to do what you do, you're not ultimately morally responsible for what you do. Is this a good argument? I think it's pretty good. What do you all think? Do you agree with this? Raise your hand if you agree with this. We have at least one, maybe two, maybe three. If you don't agree with it, why not? What's wrong here? Where does this go wrong? Yeah?
I mean, I would say I'm leaning more towards like the final because
Okay.
I don't think there is like ever like true free will, but I don't think there's ever like any true determinism, but I think they both like can create each other.
Okay.
It's like I think like something that I'm thinking about is like desire. I mean, you could argue that you only desire something because of something else that has happened.
Sure.
Because like, can you truly desire something you don't know about?
Well, let's take an extreme example, right? Why does Clarissa seek the validation of bad boys? Well, because she was treated in a past relationship by a bad boy in a certain way, and what a trauma, blah, blah, blah. Or whatever. Or you could talk about sexual desire. There's a lot of psychoanalysis we could do. Okay, so desire plays a role. Experience plays a role. But maybe you're saying we don't have to be the ultimate cause of who we are to have some sort of control over things. Okay.
I disagree with you completely. I think that you might have mental desires, like if you're going for that like example, you might have that, but it's up to your own self to control whether that comes to fruition or not in your action.
Think about it this way. When we talk about desire, that kind of clouds it a little bit because we like to think that we can choose to act out our desires or not. But what Strawson means by mental states is like everything that's going on in your head. So he would say, why are you in this class right now? Why are you dressed the way you're dressed? Why do you have the feeling that you have right now? It's because of everything going on in your head. All of the subconscious processes, the neuronal firings, the electricity going through your brain, neurotransmitters being released, chemical reactions. Do you have any control over any of that, which gives rise to your mental states? He would say no. So look, he would say you don't have control over your mental states. You might think you do, right? But when you're sad, for example, can you just turn it off? No. Did you choose to have the values that you do? No. Did you choose to have the beliefs that you do? Can you just start believing in God right now? Doesn't seem like it. So what he thinks is we do what we do because of the way that we are. The way that we are is caused by our mental states. What's going on in here, whatever that is. And because we didn't produce those, we couldn't have, ultimately, they're going to cause us to do things and we don't have control over that. So tell me what you disagree with again.
Just the specific idea that, like, to me, it kind of comes out as like because other things happen to us. Like, I guess I'm looking at it in a negative light, in the sense of, like, I look at it as people who don't take accountability for negative actions they commit due to saying, like, oh, well, this happened to me when I was a kid.
Right,
not
right.
taking control of their own thought path of, like, knowing that happened to them early on in life, knowing that it's coming out in a negative light against other people, and still not doing anything to change it because they're not taking accountability for their own free will or action.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I understand. I understand that completely. You know, let's say you're in a relationship with someone, and they have trauma, and that trauma impacts the relationship, and they're just like, well, I can't control how I act because this bad thing happened to me when I was a kid. And they're not trying to get therapy. They're not trying to work on it. How would you feel? You'd be like, no, that's not acceptable, right? You'd be like, no, you have to work on yourself. If you cared about me and you see that your trauma is impacting our relationship through no fault of my own, you should be doing something about that because you love me, and you're not. So you're not taking accountability, right? Like, you're not trying to improve things. Yeah, people feel frustrated about that all the time because we think that people have some sort of ability to make a choice. Yeah, it's a very strong intuition for us.
I feel like it's hard because in my opinion, not everybody has the same level of control.
Ah, okay. Say more about that.
I just feel like there's a lot of different factors that limit people.
Such as what?
Like economically, and like just in like politically, like my free will might be different than somebody who is economically different than mine. Like somebody who's a lot richer than me, they would just get up and go to Europe and stay for a few weeks. Where even though I desire to do that, I can't. I don't have the resources, I guess, to do that.
So there are things that, well, we could talk about class, right? We could say, look, the class that you're a part of is going to put certain constraints on you, right? In what you can do, in what is feasible, right? Yeah, for sure. What else? What else could impact, if we think people have some control over their lives, what else could impact that? Gender? Okay, why? Talk about that.
Well, because for a very long time in history, just like women not being able to vote, women
Right.
today, like, you know, the whole abortion thing, like, even if women want to, in some states we can't, like, so we don't really have free will.
And we could talk about gender roles and expectations, right? I would say gender roles and expectations, there are those for both men and women and other people, right? I was conditioned into, well, I suppose what most men are conditioned into thinking and believing, right? That I need to be the rock in my relationship, that I cannot express emotion to my partner, that I'm supposed to be the protector and provider, that if somebody attacks her, I'm going to jump in front of that person. I'm her free bodyguard whenever we go out. And that's how I'm supposed to act, right? And I do act like that. So that has conditioned how I live, right? And you have certain gendered roles and expectations that influence how you live, right? What else?
I even like super structure, like intellect and like comprehension stuff, like what you know, like your
Intelligence.
what you know, and like what you learned. Like I think like kids that are raised by parents that like teach them that they have a very certain this is what you can do, but they take thinking their choices are is like broader than someone who doesn't know about other choices.
So how much information you have is going to impact how much control over you have over your life, right? If you never knew that studying a trade was a possibility, you just went to college, right? You didn't know there were any other options. Sure.
I think a lot of these arguments don't necessarily move the bar to control of your own life, but more so the moral responsibility behind what actions you choose to do.
Ah, okay. So one discussion that we could have is how much control do we actually have over our lives? But another discussion that we could have is how much we should consider people to be morally responsible for what they do.
Yeah, because in the case of like the argument of abortion, in the case of like getting an abortion, like there's states with restrictions on getting abortions. I think the bar changes not necessarily for the action itself, but for how far you're willing to go for free will and your actions, and where that moves the morally responsible bar. So like for example, and this is a really extreme case, but like in terms of like war, when there's like people like in, not that America's really ever had wars on its own land, but like in another country, people come in to do certain things. You kill someone for like trying to hurt your family. Whereas the moral responsibility, I think, in the case of like war, or in the case of someone trying to harm you or your family, is much less immoral, I suppose, rather than just killing someone on the street.
But you might say that these people in these different situations still have the same level of control, but they don't have the same level of moral responsibility.
Yes, because like I think they still have the option, like they have an option to kill that person or not, but then the blowback can matter or whatever. But I don't think that necessarily holds them. Like they still have the free will to do that action. They can still choose not to or not, regardless of what the consequences are of killing someone or not killing someone.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't kill them, they kill your family. If you do kill them for killing somebody.
Right.
Regardless of what the consequences are, I don't think that the level of free will changes. I just think the level of what your moral responsibility is changes.
Okay, so you seem to be implying that people generally have the same control over their actions. Generally speaking.
For the most part, yeah.
For the most part,
That's
right?
right.
So you would say normal, everyday people have the same control over what they do.
Even to take it to an everyday, lesser, like not about war extent, you look at like we were talking about economic classes.
Yeah.
I think if someone who has money and wealth and they steal is more morally responsible than someone who's poor and can't afford food and steals. I don't think that their free will changes necessarily because of the lack of money to be able to take care of themselves, but I do think the moral bar is lower. It's like I've been out with friends who I know are relatively well off, I know their family's well off, and they'll steal from Target or whatever. I mean, regardless of the moral behind stealing from a corporation. But like if they have the money to purchase, so I look at them as a little bit more morally irresponsible than I would my friends who I know cannot afford and they steal food.
You're right. Or they're stealing to feed their family, right? Maybe it'll be like, okay, let's not blame them too much, right? But we can blame Greg over there because Greg makes $300K a year, right? He doesn't need to steal food, but he does it anyway.
I still feel like though that everyone, no matter who you are, does have absolute, like, when we, like, regardless, everybody is able to do whatever they want to do. In the end of the day, there's just always going to be a consequence to it. That doesn't hold people back from doing what they want to do. Obviously, putting that people in jail. So, like, in the end of the day, like, regardless of there being laws and whatnot, we all could do whatever we want. If I wanted to murder somebody right now on the street, I could.
Yeah.
But like, there is just that there's that consequence that follows. So it's like, I don't think it's a question if we have free will or not. It's just like we have consequences behind our actions and like that, like moral responsibility. But like, for example, what I'm thinking when you're talking is like, I don't think that everybody has the same amount of control, because you can't argue that an autistic person who, like, an autistic person's actions, somebody very high on the spectrum cannot be held, like, well, I guess you were saying that to the same standard that somebody who is fully capable of understanding their actions. And I think it really gets tricky when you talk about, like, people with severe mental illness, like, if you're in a crime, or true crime, like sociopaths killing their entire family and feeling nothing from it, like, how far do we say that they actually have control or not? Because it is their mental state. I mean, you could argue that they could get professional help, but in the end of the day, professional help doesn't help everyone.
Sure.
Like, some people are just mentally ill for the rest of their life, and that's just like, that's their fate, I guess you could say.
I think there is, at some points we want to say, look, everybody has the ability to make the choice that they do. But then sometimes we want to say, I don't know about that though. Think about somebody who has crippling depression. Do you think they have the same control over their actions and thought processes that you do? Let's say somebody is bipolar and they don't like how their meds make them feel, and so they stop taking their meds. And then they start creating conflict in their relationships with people. What do you think? Do you have a friend that's like that? Or have you witnessed that? Would you say that that person is morally responsible for what they're doing? Would you say they have the same level of control over their life that you do? Supposing you're not bipolar?
So my mom, she's bipolar, but because, she has kids, she chooses not to take her medication. But some days it's okay, then some days it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like she has that choice to take them if she wants to balance herself out. But she knows like the consequence. If she takes it, she feels nothing. Nothing can hit her, and nothing goes in, like nothing goes out. It's like there's nothing going in and out.
Mm-hmm.
But she knows if she doesn't, she has to deal with the ups and downs, plus other people's emotions around her as well.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we might say is, it's clear that people do things sometimes due to mental illness or disability or addiction that it doesn't seem like they have control over what they're doing, right? But can we say that they're morally responsible for what they do if they did have a choice that would have led them down a different path in the past? For example, like taking meds, right? Let's say you don't take your meds and then you have a meltdown and you end up hurting somebody out there. We might say, well, maybe your brain made you act and feel that way. But if we look back at your life and we're like, see, yesterday you had the choice of taking your meds or not, and you didn't. And that caused you to be in a scenario in which you didn't have control, but because you did have control over that, you're morally responsible for everything that followed. What do you think about that? Does that sound ridiculous?
Well, also what's confusing is that, like, when trying to compare things that are biological makeups and also, like, decisions in some way or another. Like, you can argue that addiction could be part of biological makeup because it is genetic, like it can be genetically passed on. But like,
at least propensity for it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But like, there's a huge difference between somebody who's just born like with Down syndrome and somebody who chooses to be an alcoholic. Like, there's just
somebody who just has a propensity for alcoholism, and then they lean into it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like there's just like, it's two huge different dynamics that like it's hard to compare their level of control on like the same scale, I guess.
Right,
because
right.
it's such a different and complex thing.
Well, because all these things are different, right? I mean, depression's going to be different from schizophrenia, is going to be different from bipolar disorder, is going to be different from dissociative identity disorder, is going to be, different than anxiety. Yeah, I mean, those things manifest differently. They feel differently. They produce different sensations, different feelings. You might even say different control over somebody's own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then maybe disabilities more so, right? That's like a hard cap on somebody's capacities, you might say. But then addictions, yeah, maybe that's a whole different beast entirely. Unless perhaps somebody, stuck you with a syringe and gave you a drug that you then became addicted to. A lot of people would say, like, look, if you willingly took that drug and now you're addicted, that's your fault. What do you think about that? That ring true for you?
I don't think that the addiction itself would necessarily be their fault. The choices they make after they got stuck with a needle and a drug is definitely up to them. I mean,
Okay.
And again, I think that goes hand in hand with the thing I said earlier with economic and access levels change. Like if they're extremely poor and have no access to like a thing like rehab or doctors where they can recover from that, then maybe
or no family that they can stay with that's clean.
Yeah.
Or any of that stuff.
But in like a case where it's like, I don't know, a suburbanite that lives with their parents in relatively clean environment that doesn't have a propensity for different drug-related and alcohol-related crimes, then I think that's kind of, again, one of those, what do you do after that happens, decisions that raises or lowers the moral responsibility.
Right. Maybe we're kind of stuck saying it depends on the case. It depends on the person's history. It depends on maybe even their genetic makeup, their biological makeup. Okay, so maybe yes, maybe it depends. How about this? What about somebody who grew up in a cult? What do you think? All they've ever known is the cult view. Are they responsible for when they hurt other people? When they tell other people that they are doomed, that they're terrible, that they suck? Perhaps when they lash out at others because they're not a member of the cult? Are they morally responsible for what they do? Does it depend on the cult?
I'd say I don't want to say it depends, but I guess because when a person is used to just constantly having the same thing stuck, being written in their head, it's basically telling your brain, this is okay, that's okay, this is okay. So when you see other things that's not what you're used to, it kind of puts you in like, no, I have to prove my point. I have to prove my point.
Defense mode?
Yeah, so it's just like, it's like, it's not per se their fault, but how you take that information and to try to bring awareness to it is your accountability for it, because how you do it is on you, because you can't force somebody to join a cult. You can't force somebody to take in the information, nor can you force somebody to agree with your opinion.
Yeah.
So
think about a child who has only lived in this place, and now they're 18, and they've grown up with this view. They've grown up with these people who have given them a specific worldview, a set of values, and everything. Are they responsible for what they do out in the world?
Well, I feel like it's also just like ignorance at some point, because like, not like obviously when they're an innocent child and that's all they know, but when you get to a certain age or a point in life where you realize that there's other views around you, I think there is some sort of responsibility you take, because now you are not just only seeing one thing, like you're seeing many different things, and I think that's where it comes back on you to make that decision. I guess against like the morally right and wrong way to view things. But
So you're saying if they have access to alternative
Right.
perspectives and views,
that it's their responsibility at that point. If they never get out into the world and see like that's all they think the world is made up of, then I don't know. I don't think that they can really be blamed for that because they're brainwashed.
because they've never known anything else,
Yeah.
right? We're living during a time in human history in which we have more access to information than ever. Just go on the internet. You can find out basically anything about anything. So, given that, do we think that people have some sort of responsibility to be self-informed?
I would say yes, because other views, if you weren't in a cult, no matter what, there are so many views out there. And
Yeah.
You should be respectful to have other views, but you shouldn't push anyone to believe what you believe and basically take away everything that they found.
Okay.
Because I find it disrespectful to be like, oh, you should believe this or that.
To like
That's-
force something down somebody's
yeah,
throat.
when it's obviously it's not going to be the topic like abortion, the Christian faith, anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because not everyone believes in whatever.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe it depends on whether or not they have access to the information. Yeah.
I mean, personally, I think for like all these things, I think if you have like the ability to like view and understand the effect you have on other people, it's selfish to say that you don't have a choice
Okay.
on what you do. Like I think like for like just all of this, I think it's kind of like a really self-absorbed view to be like, I don't have a choice because of this and this, where it's like there's always something going on in your head where it's like I can do this or I can do this, or you can see someone and be like, oh, I just yelled at them, I made them cry, like I did something bad. So I think if you have the mental capacity to understand that, you have the mental capacity to make a better choice.
Okay, and then you would be morally responsible,
Yeah.
perhaps. Okay, so maybe it depends on the cult. Maybe it depends on the access that whoever is growing up in a cult has to the outside world, to other information. How about an easier one? Let's go back to the example I used before. I'm an expert neurosurgeon and physicist and biologist and chemist, and I'm also an expert tinkerer and engineer, mechanical and electrical engineer. And I cut open your skull and I place a bunch of stuff connected to your brain such that when I press a certain button, you're going to do something or feel a certain way. Are people who are mind controlled morally responsible for what they do? If I make you fling your arm up and you hit your friend Sarah, are you responsible for that? No?
But then you could argue that that mind control is what God is.
Perhaps. I think a lot of Christians would say that God has given people free will. What do you think? I think that's a common view.
Yeah, but I also feel like for some reason when people do like bad things, God is never responsible for that. It's always the devil that was responsible for that. So it's like free will, but only when it's good things that you're doing.
That's interesting because I've heard numerous views. And I learned numerous views growing up because I grew up in the Christian church. One view is the devil's partly responsible because the devil leads people to temptation. Another view is no, you're fully responsible for what you do. Do a better job. Don't give in to temptation. Another view is you're morally responsible for the bad things that you do. But ultimately, God is morally responsible for the good things that you do because you can only do things due to the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So on and so forth. That's actually a great segue into our next consideration. Based on the fact that a lot of you seem to think that you have some kind of control over your actions, and therefore people are morally responsible for things, that suggests to me that you don't believe in materialism, that you don't believe in the contemporary scientific view. Because if you were just composed of atoms, protons, electrons, neutrons, subatomic particles, waves, all of these things that are just pushed and pulled by natural processes and the laws of nature, is there any such thing as a person? And is there any such thing as you having any control over any of that? If you're a purely natural physical thing, can you have control over yourself? Is there any you there? If you're just a collection of atoms? See what I'm saying? So let's just stipulate. All you are is a collection of atoms. Okay, do you have free will? What do you think? All you are is a collection of atoms and molecules.
No.
You wouldn't think so, right? But I guess it depends on your definition of free will. So you see how we come back to metaphysics. The kind of thing that you think you are is going to influence whether or not you think you have free will, whether or not you think people are morally responsible. A lot of scientists, for example, because they think that we are just physical, natural things, a collection of atoms like a table is, people don't have free will. It's an illusion. Consequently, people aren't morally responsible for stuff. But perhaps if you hold a dualistic view or an idealistic view like Berkeley had, you might be able to say, yeah, what I am is not a physical thing. I have a physical body, but somehow part of me is outside the laws of nature. I can move stuff and do stuff because I'm not subject just to what my neurons are doing. I'm not caused just by what my brain is doing because I am not my brain. I'm something more than that. Perhaps you could say, if God exists, that is how you would explain how and why people have free will. I'm sure you could come up with another argument for how or why free will could exist, but... So, reflect on that. Do you think you are basically the same thing as a table? Or is there a part of you that's immaterial, that's non-physical? You have a spirit or a soul or a consciousness that stands outside of the laws of nature. Because what you think about that is going to influence a lot of other things. So, we certainly act as if people have free will. Right? We think that people do. We treat people like they do. Right? We punish people for what they do. We chastise people, and we should say, you shouldn't have lied to your boyfriend. Right? You shouldn't have beat him up, George. That was bad. You should be honest in your classes. You shouldn't cheat. But if free will ultimately doesn't exist, does it make sense to tell people that they should or should not do things? Or that they should or should not be irrational? What do you think? It's tricky, right? Throw these words all around all the time, like should and ought. But a lot of philosophers think that If those words are going to make any sense, we have to presuppose that free will exists. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to say, you should have done this, because you didn't have a choice. The serial killer didn't choose to murder those people. He had no choice. His brain just made him do it.
But I feel like that's not what free will really is. It just is like, I don't know, like I don't feel like just because you have free will, that doesn't mean that you don't have any sense of control at all. You know what I mean? Like,
This is something that the compatibilists often bring up. They will say, look, it's not as if your actions and your thoughts are random. They call people reasons responsive. They'll say, you are responsive to reasons. If I give you a reason to do something, you'll respond in a particular way. So maybe that has something to do with free will and moral responsibility. The fact that you are reasons responsive. In a way that perhaps when it comes to empathy and morality, psychopaths and sociopaths are not. They don't feel the same tug that you might. Yeah? Let me ask you one final question. Is it possible for us to ever prove that we have free will or not? Can we prove or know that free will exists? What do you think? A lot of scientists think, just look at science. Science proves to us that we don't have free will. Does it? You're like, I don't know about that. It sounds fishy.
I feel like if you would have to, like, to prove something like that, it would have to be, like, you saying, I want to do this, and then going and doing it. And that would prove it.
Would it?
But, like, I'm saying you can't though. Like,
Oh, yeah,
like,
yeah.
For example, in some ways, like, you could do crazy things, like I said, like, if I was like, I want to go kill that guy right now.
Or like this.
I could go do it, yeah. But
did my brain just make me do that? And I have an illusion that I did it freely, you know?
Yeah. But, like, in other ways, if I was like, I want to go to the airport and get on a plane right now and go across the world, like, I can't do that.
Yeah. I can't do that
I
either.
could if I had money, but I don't, so it's like I can't. So I don't have free will to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue, I feel like free will in itself is like limited to other, like, free will, because, like, really you do have the free will. Like, you could just, like, go to the airport and, like, try to get on the plane, you know, like, do something, like, ski.
Yeah.
Like, you'll never be, because your environment has the same free will to react to your choices as you do.
So are you saying something like everybody has the freedom to try? But it doesn't mean you're going to succeed because, look, the world is a certain way. People feel a certain way. You know, American Airlines is not going to let you get on that plane unless you paid for a ticket because they're like, screw you, we want our money.
Or they, like, could. Like, someone
Right?
might just, like, have whoever, like, the attendant person is like, taking a ticket. Like,
Yeah, maybe
they
they're
have the
feeling
same
eccentric
free
that day.
will.
They're like, you know, yeah, I'm going to let her get on. Why? I'm feeling a little dangerous, you know? Yeah, maybe, yeah. Okay, so you want to hold on to this idea of free will. Do you think we could ever know or prove that we have it?
I don't know if you can ever prove anything.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, sometimes I feel the same way. Does anybody think we can prove or disprove it? Here are the facts. Science seems to show us that this stuff follows certain laws and principles. And it doesn't violate them, right? This is never going to fly upwards. This is never going to generate a gravitational field strong enough to suck you into it, right? Because it has a certain mass. Two electrons are always going to repel when they get close together, right? They're never going to attract. So there seem to be certain rules and laws baked into the universe. If for physical things, they're going to say that suggests free will doesn't exist. But it certainly feels like we have free will. From the inside, it feels like you could do anything, right? You could leave the room right now. You could flip over this table. You could scream out. But is that feeling, is that perception enough alone to prove that you have it? Maybe that feeling or perception is just an illusion. So, I'll leave you with this to chew on. In his famous short work, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant says the following. He says that we're never going to be able to prove or disprove the existence of free will. But if we're going to make sense out of morality, if we're going to tell people there are things that they should do and shouldn't do, if we're going to tell people there are things that they should think and shouldn't think, we must presuppose that it exists, even if we can't know it. Our ethics, our criminal justice system, punishment and reward, praise and blame, it all requires that we presuppose it. And insofar as we don't want to stop punishing people or locking people up or blaming people and praising others and rewarding others and making claims of people, telling them they should do things, he would say, it doesn't seem like this idea or belief in free will is something that we can or should try to get rid of, even if it's a fantasy. So, chew on that. Ask your friends about this. See what they think. It's always fun to have these conversations with people. Okay, does anybody have any questions, concerns?
So for the
I'll let you all go. Make sure to sign the attendance sheet before you leave.
So for the reflection